The rain had not stopped since they lowered the casket into the ground, and Clara Whitfield sat in the front parlor of a house that no longer felt like home, listening to a stranger decide the rest of her life. Attorney Harold Pierce cleared his throat, unfolding the will with the slow, deliberate care of a man who already knew how the room would react. Around him, black dresses and dark suits pressed close together on borrowed chairs, and at the center of it all sat Margaret, spine straight, eyes dry, a widow's composure stitched together like armor. "To my wife, Margaret Whitfield," Pierce began, "the family estate in its entirety." A soft exhale rippled through the room. Approval, relief, expectation confirmed. "To my children, Daniel and Rebecca Whitfield, full ownership of Whitfield Manufacturing, and all associated accounts." Clara kept her hands folded in her lap, nails pressing crescents into her palms. She had stopped expecting anything from her father years ago, not since Margaret had rewritten what family meant inside these walls. Still, some small, foolish part of her had hoped. Pierce hesitated, glancing up before he continued. "And to my daughter, Clara Whitfield, the old barn and surrounding acreage on the north property line." Silence first, then laughter. Quiet, cruel, barely contained behind Rebecca's hand. A barn. Rotting wood and broken fences no one had touched in 15 years. That was what remained of her father's love. Margaret's eyes found hers across the room, and for one unguarded second, something flickered there that wasn't triumph. It was closer to fear. Clara noticed it even through her humiliation, even through the heat rising in her throat. Whatever that barn was, Margaret didn't want her anywhere near it. And for the first time since her father died, Clara felt something other than grief. She felt curious. Clara was 11 when Margaret first walked through the front door carrying 2 children and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Back then, Clara hadn't understood what was shifting beneath her feet. She only knew that her father's laugh grew quieter around her, that his attention began drifting toward Daniel's report cards and Rebecca's recitals long before it ever landed on her. Margaret never raised her voice. She didn't have to. Exclusion, Clara learned, could be delivered in perfectly polite sentences. "Maybe next year, Clara. This trip is really for the little ones. You understand, don't you? You're older. You're stronger." Being older never felt like strength. It felt like being quietly moved to the back of every photograph, seated at the far end of every table, remembered last in every decision that mattered. Her father noticed sometimes. Clara caught him watching her with something like guilt in his eyes, but he never said anything. Frank Whitfield had built an empire out of not making waves, and somewhere along the way, keeping peace in his marriage had become more important than keeping his daughter close. By the time Clara left for college, the distance between them had calcified into something neither of them knew how to undo. Holidays became obligations. Phone calls became shorter, and when her father's health began to fail 2 years ago, it was Margaret who controlled the hospital room. Margaret who decided who could visit and when. Clara had shown up anyway, every week, every visit unwelcome, every conversation supervised. She told herself it didn't matter, that she didn't need his money or his name to know he loved her. But sitting in that parlor, hearing what he'd left her, she couldn't help wondering if somewhere beneath Margaret's practiced control, her father had tried to tell her something after all. A barn didn't feel like nothing anymore. It felt like a door only Clara had been given the key to. The road to the north acreage hadn't been maintained in years, and Clara's car bounced over ruts and loose gravel as the manor shrank behind her in the rearview mirror. She hadn't driven this way since she was a child, back when this land still belonged to laughter instead of silence. The barn came into view slowly, reluctantly, as though the land itself were reminding her it had once been beautiful. Ivy had swallowed half the western wall. The roof sagged in the middle like a tired spine, and the wide double doors, once painted a cheerful red, had faded to the color of dried blood. Weeds choked the path leading up to it, tall enough to brush against Clara's knees as she stepped out of the car. But beneath the decay, she recognized it instantly. This had been her mother's place. Before the cancer took her, before Margaret ever crossed their threshold, Elaine Whitfield used to spend her afternoons here, humming softly while she repotted flowers or repaired old furniture with the kind of patience Clara had never fully appreciated until it was gone. The barn had smelled like cedar and lavender then. Now it smelled like mildew and neglect. Clara pushed one of the doors open, hinges groaning in protest, and stepped into the dim, dust-filled interior. Light slanted through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating particles that drifted like memories refusing to settle. She should have felt only sadness standing there. Instead, an unease crept up the back of her neck, subtle and persistent. 15 years of neglect should have looked different than this. The support beams were untouched by rot, sturdy despite everything else falling apart around them. Someone had let the barn decay on the surface while quietly ensuring its bones stayed intact. That wasn't abandonment. That was preservation, disguised as ruin. Clara turned in a slow circle, studying the shadows, feeling suddenly certain that whatever her mother had left behind in this place, someone had gone to great lengths to make sure it stayed hidden, but never destroyed. Margaret arrived at Clara's apartment 3 days later, unannounced, dressed as though grief were something she wore only for appearances now that the will had been read. "I won't stay long," she said, settling onto the edge of the couch without being invited to sit. "I wanted to discuss the barn." Clara folded her arms. "What about it?" "It's an eyesore, Clara. A liability, really. I'd hate for you to feel burdened by something so impractical." Margaret's smile was smooth, rehearsed. "I'd like to buy it from you. A fair price, of course. More than fair." She named a number that made Clara's breath catch. It was absurd. Obscene even for a few collapsing acres and a barn that couldn't fetch a fraction of that on any open market. Clara studied her stepmother's face, searching for the seams beneath the composure, and found something flickering there she hadn't expected. Urgency. "Why would you offer that much for something worthless?" Clara asked carefully. "Sentimental reasons," Margaret said too quickly. "Your father wanted that land cleared eventually. I'm simply honoring his wishes." But Frank had left it to Clara specifically, deliberately, and no one paid a fortune to honor a dead man's vague wishes about an old barn. Not unless something inside those walls was worth far more than the land itself. "I'll think about it," Clara said. Margaret's expression cooled instantly, the warmth sliding off her face like water off glass. "Don't think too long. Old buildings like that aren't safe. Things can happen to them quickly, whether fire, structural collapse." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "It would be such a shame to lose whatever's left of your mother's memories in there." She left without another word. Clara sat frozen on her own couch, understanding now with sudden, cold clarity. Margaret wasn't offering to buy the barn. She was trying to make sure Clara never looked inside it. Clara called Margaret the next morning and declined the offer, keeping her voice steady even as her stepmother's silence stretched cold and pointed on the other end of the line. Then she drove back out to the barn with work gloves, trash bags, and a determination that surprised her. If Margaret wanted this place gone that badly, Clara intended to find out why before anyone else did. The first few hours were simple labor, hauling out broken furniture, sweeping decades of dust and dead leaves into growing piles by the door. But as she cleared the far corner where her mother used to keep her potting table, Clara's hands slowed. Beneath a moth-eaten tarp sat a wooden trunk she hadn't seen since childhood. Her mother's trunk. Clara knelt in front of it, fingers trembling slightly as she unlatched the rusted clasp. Inside were journals with cracked leather covers, stacks of photographs curling at the edges, and pressed flowers gone brittle and colorless with age. She lifted one photograph, her mother laughing on this very property, sunlight caught in her dark hair, a version of happiness Clara barely remembered existing. Tucked beneath the journals, wrapped in an old scarf, was a small metal box sealed with a lock Clara didn't have a key for. She turned it over in her hands, weighing it, feeling the faint shift of something solid inside. Her mother had never been careless. Everything Elaine Whitfield did had intention behind it. The way she arranged her garden, the way she chose her words, the way she'd once told a much younger Clara, asterisk, "When you need answers, look where no one else thinks to look," asterisk. Clara stared at the locked box, heart quickening. This wasn't clutter left behind by grief. This was a message carefully hidden, patiently waiting. Her mother had left something here on purpose. Something meant only for Clara. Something important enough that 15 years later, Margaret was still desperate to keep it buried. Clara tucked the box under her arm and kept digging. By the following weekend, Clara had returned with a toolbox, determined to assess the barn structure before deciding what could be salvaged. She pressed her boot against the floorboards near the old potting table, testing for rot, when one plank shifted beneath her weight with a hollow, unnatural sound. Not soft, not rotted, hollow. Clara knelt down, running her fingers along the seams until she found the edge of a panel cut too precisely to be accidental damage. She pried it upward with the flat end of a crowbar, and the wood came away easily, as though it had been lifted many times before by careful hands. Beneath it, a shallow compartment built directly into the barn's foundation, lined with what looked like waterproofed cloth, long since gone gray with age. Clara's breath caught. Inside sat a second metal box, more rusted than the one she'd already found, and beside it, a thick bundle of letters bound with twine that had nearly disintegrated. She lifted them out with careful hands, laying each item gently on the floor beside her like pieces of a puzzle she didn't yet understand. The letters were addressed in her mother's handwriting, but tucked beneath them, half hidden, was something that made Clara's pulse stutter. A leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with columns of numbers, dates, and notations. And the handwriting inside wasn't her mother's. It was Margaret's. Clara stared at the looping, familiar script, the same handwriting she'd seen on birthday cards and holiday notes for 15 years, now filling page after page of figures that meant nothing to her yet. Transfers, account numbers, dates stretching back further than Clara had realized Margaret had even known her father. Why would her mother hide something written by Margaret? Unless her mother had found this ledger herself, somewhere else entirely, and hidden it here, in the one place she knew Margaret would never think to search, because Margaret had never considered this barn worth anything at all. Clara sat back on her heels, the barn suddenly feeling colder, smaller, heavier with meaning. Whatever this ledger recorded, her mother had died believing it mattered enough to protect. Now Clara needed to understand why. Clara waited until she was home, door locked, tea gone cold beside her, before she allowed herself to untie the fragile bundle of letters. Her mother's handwriting filled every page, familiar, elegant, achingly alive in a way photographs never managed to capture. Some letters were addressed to no one, private reflections rather than correspondence. Others were drafts, crossed out and rewritten, as though Elaine had been building toward a confrontation she never got to finish. I saw them again today. One letter read, Margaret and Richard Voss, at the property office downtown. She says she's helping Frank review the manufacturing contracts, but I've seen how she looks at him. I've seen how long they linger over papers that shouldn't take that long to read. Clara's stomach tightened. Richard Voss had been her father's business partner for decades, a name she'd grown up hearing at dinner tables, a man she'd always trusted. Further letters revealed more. Elaine had grown suspicious not just of an affair, but of something colder, more calculated. Money moving between accounts that didn't belong to her father, contracts altered just enough to redirect company funds into channels Frank never approved. Margaret hadn't simply been unfaithful. She had been building something. Years before she ever married into the family, she'd already begun embedding herself into its finances. I confronted her. The final letter read, the handwriting shakier than the others. She denied everything, of course. But I saw fear in her eyes, real fear, and I understand now what that means. If something happens to me, Clara needs to know the truth. I've hidden the proof somewhere Margaret would never think to look, somewhere she's always considered beneath her. Clara set the letter down, hands trembling. 6 weeks after that confrontation, her mother had died in what everyone called a tragic accident. Clara had never questioned it. No one had. But sitting there now, surrounded by proof of a betrayal that ran far deeper than she'd ever imagined, Clara understood with sickening clarity that her mother hadn't just uncovered an affair. She had uncovered a motive, and possibly the reason she never lived long enough to expose it. Clara returned to the barn 2 days later to retrieve the rest of her mother's belongings. And the moment she stepped through the doorway, she knew something had changed. The padlock she'd fastened on her last visit lay snapped open on the ground, its metal shank sheared clean through. Dirt near the hidden floor panel had been disturbed, boot prints pressed into the soft earth where no rain had fallen to soften them. Someone had been here. Someone had been looking. Clara's pulse climbed as she surveyed the room, cataloging what was missing, relieved to find the ledger and letters still safely hidden where she'd tucked them beneath the loose board. Inside her jacket, wrapped tight, the only place she trusted anymore. Whoever had come hadn't found what they were searching for, but they knew where to look. That meant Margaret hadn't simply suspected something was hidden here. She knew. Clara thought of the offer to buy the barn, the strange urgency behind Margaret's smile, the warning about fires and structural collapse. What had sounded like manipulation before now felt like a threat wearing a softer disguise. If Margaret was willing to send someone out here at night, break a lock, dig through disturbed earth searching for proof that could unravel everything she'd built, she was willing to do far worse to make sure Clara never used it. Clara drove home with her hands tight on the wheel, checking her rearview mirror more than she wanted to admit, aware for the first time that this had stopped being only about inheritance or old grudges. Her mother had died after finding this ledger, and now Clara was the only person left who knew it existed. She locked her apartment door twice that night, and for the first time since the funeral, she wasn't grieving her father. She was afraid of what protecting his secrets might cost her. It took Clara 3 sleepless nights to understand what she was looking at, spreading the ledger's pages across her kitchen table alongside her mother's letters, cross-referencing dates and figures until the pattern finally clicked into place. Margaret hadn't married her father for love. She had married him for access. The earliest entries dated back nearly 2 years before the wedding, small transfers at first, disguised as consulting fees paid to a company called Ashcombe Holdings. Clara searched the name and found nothing but a shell corporation registered in Richard Voss's name, with no employees, no offices, no purpose beyond receiving money that quietly disappeared from Whitfield Manufacturing's accounts. Over time, the transfers grew larger, bolder. By the time Margaret walked down the aisle, she and Voss had already siphoned enough to build a financial cushion entirely separate from Frank's knowledge. Money meant to protect them both if the marriage, or the company, ever collapsed. Elaine must have found records of this months before her death, matching the same handwriting, the same account numbers, piecing together a betrayal far more calculated than infidelity. And she had confronted Margaret directly. 6 weeks later, she was dead. Clara sat back, ice settling into her chest as the final pieces aligned. This was why the barn. Not because it held sentimental value to Margaret, but because it held none. The one place on the entire estate she never bothered to control, never thought to search, because she had always considered it beneath her attention. This was why hidden. Her mother had known she was in danger, had understood that whatever happened to her, this evidence needed to survive, waiting patiently for the one person who would eventually inherit that worthless, forgotten barn. And this was who else knew. Richard Voss, her father's oldest friend, still active in the company, still very much alive, still very much invested in making sure this L. Clara requested the meeting under the pretense of discussing the barn sale, and Margaret agreed almost too eagerly, choosing the manor study. Her territory, her rules, the same room where Clara had once been told she wasn't wanted at family trips and holiday photographs. This time, Clara walked in and set the ledger on the desk between them. Margaret's composure held for exactly 3 seconds before it cracked. "Where did you find that?" she said quietly, all pretense of warmth gone from her voice. "Where you never bothered to look," Clara answered. "The barn you called worthless." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for the ledger, then stopped herself, as though touching it might make the evidence more real than it already was. "You don't understand what you're holding. I understand my mother found this before she died. I understand she confronted you about it. And I understand she died 6 weeks later." Clara kept her voice steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "That's not a coincidence, is it?" The silence that followed answered louder than words could have. Margaret's expression shifted, fear giving way to something colder, more calculating. You have no idea what you're threatening to unravel. Richard has resources you can't imagine. People who owe him favors, people who make problems disappear. She leaned forward, voice dropping low. Your mother thought she was untouchable too. Is that a confession? That's a warning. Margaret's eyes hardened. Take the money I offered you, sign whatever needs signing, and walk away from all of this. Or find out exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect what I've spent 15 years building. Clara's pulse roared in her ears, but she didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't give Margaret the satisfaction of watching fear take hold. You should have burned that barn down when you had the chance, she said quietly, gathering the ledger back into her arms. By the time Clara reached her car, her phone was already buzzing with a text from an unknown number. Asterisk reconsider. Last chance. Asterisk. She didn't reply. She drove straight to the office of Harold Pierce, the same attorney who had read her father's will, and laid everything on his desk. The ledger, the letters, the timeline she'd pieced together over sleepless nights. Pierce's expression darkened with every page he turned. This needs to be duplicated immediately, he said. Copies in multiple locations. If the original disappears, we need something that still holds up. Clara didn't ask why he sounded certain something would try to disappear. She already knew. Within hours, Pierce had connected her with a forensic accountant named Diane Okafor, a sharp, unflinching woman who specialized in untangling exactly this kind of financial deception. Diane spent the evening scanning the ledger's entries, cross-referencing account numbers against public filings, confirming what Clara already suspected. Ashcombe Holdings was real, active, and still quietly funneling money even now. This isn't just old fraud, Diane said grimly. It's ongoing, which means whoever's involved has every reason to make sure this evidence disappears fast. That night, Clara's apartment building lost power unexpectedly. A breaker box tampered with, according to the maintenance worker who couldn't explain how. 2 streets over, a car idled far longer than necessary outside her window before finally pulling away. Clara didn't sleep. She sat awake with copies of everything spread across her kitchen table. A second set locked in her car. A third emailed securely to Pierce's private server. Margaret was moving fast now, calling in favors, working every connection Richard Voss's money could buy to bury this before it reached anyone who mattered. But Clara had one advantage Margaret hadn't accounted for. She had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. By morning, Pierce had scheduled an emergency meeting with the family's remaining lawyers. Margaret wouldn't see it coming until it was already too late to stop. The study felt smaller than Clara remembered, crowded now with lawyers, accountants, and the family she'd spent a lifetime standing at the edges of. Daniel and Rebecca sat stiffly beside their mother, unaware of what the next 20 minutes would cost them. Margaret sat at the head of the table, composed, confident, clearly believing she still controlled the room. Clara intended to make sure she didn't. Pierce opened the meeting by explaining that new information had come to light regarding the estate. Information relevant enough to delay the final distribution of assets. Margaret's smile flickered but held, until Clara set copies of the ledger in front of every person at the table. This is Ashcombe Holdings, Clara said, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. A shell company created before my father married Margaret. Used to funnel money out of Whitfield manufacturing for over a decade. Rebecca frowned, flipping through pages she didn't yet understand. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, Diane Okafor interjected, sliding forward her own analysis. These transfers match dates, amounts, and account numbers still active as of this year. Someone has been stealing from this family since before some of you were born. Margaret's composure finally cracked. This is fabricated. Grief has clearly clouded her judgment. My mother's handwriting is in these letters, Clara said, laying them beside the ledger. She found this before she died. She confronted you about it. 6 weeks later, she was gone. Silence swallowed the room. Daniel's face drained of color as he looked at his mother, searching for the denial that didn't come fast enough to matter. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again, the practice control she'd worn for 15 years finally abandoning her in front of the children she'd built her entire deception to protect. "You threatened me," Clara continued, quieter now, steadier. "You told me to walk away or find out how far you'd go. I think everyone here deserves to know exactly what that meant." Pierce placed a folder in front of the family's legal counsel. Copies already filed, already secured, already beyond anyone's ability to make disappear. Margaret's carefully constructed world, built on stolen money and buried grief, collapsed in the space of a single silent room. For the first time in 15 years, Clara wasn't the one being dismissed. The weeks that followed moved faster than Clara expected, as though the truth, once released, refused to be contained again. Margaret was formally charged within days. Fraud, embezzlement, and eventually, following a renewed investigation into Elaine's death, suspicion serious enough that authorities reopened a case everyone had long considered closed. Richard Voss disappeared before charges could be filed against him, though Diane Okafor assured Clara it was only a matter of time before the financial trail led investigators directly to him. The estate, once so cleanly divided in Margaret's favor, was reassessed entirely. Assets improperly transferred through Ashcombe Holdings were traced, frozen, and slowly returned to their rightful place within Whitfield Manufacturing. Daniel and Rebecca, shaken but honest once the truth surfaced, cooperated fully, distancing themselves from a mother whose loyalty had never truly extended to them either. Clara didn't ask for revenge. She asked only for what had been stolen to be restored. Her mother's name cleared of suspicion, her father's legacy separated from the corruption that had quietly poisoned it for years. It was Pierce who found the final piece, tucked away in Frank Whitfield's private safe deposit box, discovered during the estate's reassessment. A letter, handwritten, dated only months before his death. "If anything happens to me, and Clara ever needs answers, tell her to look where her mother always felt safest. Elaine trusted that place more than she ever trusted me to protect her secrets. I should have listened to her sooner." Clara read it 3 times before the tears finally came. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to relief. Her father had known. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to understand that Elaine had left something behind worth protecting, and enough to trust that Clara would be the one to find it. The barn hadn't been an insult after all. It had been her father's quiet, final act of faith in her, the only inheritance that had ever truly meant something. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't feel like the daughter who came second. She felt like the daughter who was finally seen. Spring arrived slowly that year, but when it came, Clara was already standing in the barn with sawdust on her hands and sunlight pouring through a newly repaired roof. The renovation had taken months. New beams reinforcing the old ones, fresh paint replacing what had faded to almost nothing. The hollow compartment beneath the floor sealed now, its secret finally spent. She hadn't torn down the past to build something new. She had simply given it room to breathe again. Her mother's potting table sat restored near the window, the same spot where Elaine used to hum softly while working the soil, and Clara had planted lavender along the entrance. The scent she remembered from childhood finally returning to a place that had spent 15 years pretending to be empty. Standing in the doorway now, Clara understood something she hadn't been able to see the day Pierce first read her father's will. This barn had never been an insult. It had never been worthless or forgotten or beneath consideration. It had been the one place strong enough to hold a truth that everything else in her family had tried to bury. A truth that cost her mother her life and nearly cost Clara her safety, but had ultimately given her something no mansion or fortune ever could. It had given her back her mother's courage, preserved patiently beneath rotting floorboards until the right hands were ready to find it. It had given her justice, finally, after 15 years of silence. And it had given her clarity about who she was, not the daughter who came second, not the one dismissed with muffled laughter in a crowded parlor, but the one entrusted with the truth all along. Clara ran her hand along the freshly painted doorframe, feeling the quiet strength of a place finally restored to what it once was. The mansion had gone to Margaret's children. The company had gone to lawyers and courts and careful reassessment. But this small, stubborn, resilient piece of land had always been the most valuable inheritance she was ever given. and she intended to keep it standing for the rest of her life.